The city's skyline glittered like a promise broken, its lights sharp against the dawn as Jacob Anderson stood frozen on the tarmac, the roar of a private jet's engines fading into a deafening silence. His calloused hands, still smelling of grease and steel, clutched a business card that felt heavier than the wrench he'd held for decades. The name on it, Richard Blackwell, CEO of Horizon Tech, burned into his mind, a name that belonged to a world of glass towers and billion-dollar deals, not to a mechanic from a nowhere town in Texas. Just hours ago, Richard had stepped out of that jet, his polished shoes glinting under the sun, and offered Jacob a future he couldn't comprehend. "You've built something extraordinary, Jacob," he'd said, his voice smooth but urgent. "This robot of yours could change millions of lives. I want to make you a part of it." The words had hit like a thunderclap, leaving Jacob's heart pounding with a mix of awe and dread. How had it come to this? A man who'd spent his life fixing cars, who'd never dreamed beyond the walls of his garage, now stood at the edge of a destiny he hadn't asked for. The jet was gone now, swallowed by the horizon, but its shadow lingered, a reminder of the choice Jacob had made. He'd said yes to Richard, yes to a partnership that promised millions, yes to a world where his name might mean something more than the guy who fixed your pickup. But as he stood there, the wind cold against his face, doubt clawed at him. He wasn't built for this. He was a man of tools and toil, not boardrooms and contracts. And yet, the memory of Emma's smile, the little girl for whom he'd built the robot, flickered in his mind, her laughter a beacon in the storm of his thoughts. She was why he'd done it, why he'd poured his nights into a clunky machine that gave her the chance to walk, to play, to be a kid. But now, that small act of kindness had spiraled into something vast, something that terrified him as much as it thrilled him. Jacob's boots crunched against the gravel as he turned back toward his garage, its faded sign swaying in the breeze. The world felt different now, as if the ground had shifted beneath him. He could still see Richard's face, the CEO's sharp eyes studying him like a puzzle to be solved. "You have no idea what you're sitting on," Richard had said, handing him the card with a number that made Jacob's stomach lurch, more zeros than he'd ever seen. It wasn't just money, it was a vision, a future where Emma's robot wasn't just a one-off miracle but a spark that could light up the lives of millions. Jacob had nodded, his voice caught in his throat, but now, alone, he wondered if he'd made a deal with a devil he didn't understand. What did a man like Richard want with him? And what would this new world demand of a man who'd only ever known the hum of engines and the weight of a wrench? The garage loomed ahead, its familiar walls a stark contrast to the sleek jet that had invaded his life. Jacob pushed open the door, the scent of oil and rust wrapping around him like a memory. His workbench was still cluttered with the robot's blueprints, sketches scribbled in the dead of night, each line a testament to the weeks he'd spent chasing a dream for a girl he barely knew. Emma's face flashed before him, her wide eyes, her trembling voice asking, "Is that for me?" when he'd wheeled the robot to her house. That moment, her first steps with the machine's help, had been worth every sleepless night, every failed prototype. But now, the robot was more than a gift, it was a key to a world Jacob wasn't sure he belonged in. He sank onto a stool, the business card slipping from his fingers, and let the weight of it all crash over him. How had a single act of kindness brought him here, to this precipice where everything he knew was at stake? The city's pulse was a distant hum, but Jacob's mind was louder, replaying the moment Richard had stepped off the jet. The man's presence had been overwhelming, his suit a sharp contrast to the dust of Jacob's world. "I've seen what you've done for that girl," Richard had said, his voice carrying a weight that made Jacob's skin prickle. "You've got something special, Jacob. Not just skill, but heart. That's what I'm investing in." The words had felt like praise, but now they sounded like a trap, a lure to pull him from the life he'd built. Jacob's eyes drifted to the robot's frame, still sitting in the corner of the garage, its wires and gears a silent witness to the choice he'd made. He'd built it for Emma, not for fame, not for money. But the world had noticed, and now it was pulling him into its orbit, whether he was ready or not. His thoughts were interrupted by the creak of the garage door. Maria, Emma's mother, stood there, her face etched with worry. "Jacob, what's going on?" she asked, her voice soft but urgent. "I heard about the jet. Are you okay?" Jacob hesitated, the truth too heavy to share. How could he explain that the robot he'd built for her daughter had caught the eye of a tech giant? That his life, their lives, might never be the same. "I don't know, Maria," he said finally, his voice rough. "I built it for Emma, to help her. Now, it's bigger than me." Maria's eyes widened, but she didn't press. She just nodded, her hand resting on the doorframe, and in her silence, Jacob felt the weight of her trust, her hope. It was the same trust Emma had shown him, the same hope that had driven him to keep going when the robot seemed impossible. As Maria left, the garage felt emptier, the shadows deeper. Jacob picked up the business card, its edges worn from his grip, and stared at Richard's name. The man had promised to fly him to New York tomorrow, to a meeting that could change everything. But what did that mean? A new life? A new Jacob? The thought made his chest tighten. He wasn't ready to leave this place, this life, the man he'd been. Yet the memory of Emma's laughter, her small hand gripping the robot's frame as she took her first steps, pulled at him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about her, about others like her, about a chance to do something bigger than himself. He closed his eyes, the hum of the garage his only company, and felt the truth settle in his bones. He couldn't turn back now. But to understand how he'd reached this moment, he had to go back to the day he decided to build the robot, back to the girl whose smile had changed everything. Weeks earlier, the Texas sun had been merciless, baking the cracked asphalt outside Jacob's garage. The air was thick with dust, the kind that clung to your skin and never let go. Jacob was under a pickup, his hands buried in its guts, when the bell above the door jingled. He slid out, wiping sweat from his brow, expecting another local with a busted radiator. Instead, Maria stood there, her face tired but kind, and beside her was Emma, a 10-year-old girl in a wheelchair, her eyes brighter than the sun outside. "Jacob," Maria said, her voice hesitant, "Emma's got something to ask you." The girl looked up at him, her small hands twisting in her lap, and said, "I wish I could play like the other kids." Her words were soft, but they hit Jacob like a freight train, cracking something open inside him he hadn't known was there. He'd seen Emma around town before, always with that same determined smile, but this was different. Her plea wasn't just a wish, it was a challenge, a call to do something he'd never done. Jacob wasn't an inventor, wasn't a dreamer. He fixed things, cars, trucks, the occasional tractor. But as he looked into Emma's eyes, he saw a spark that mirrored his own stubborn refusal to give up. "I'll see what I can do," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Maria's face softened, and Emma's smile was like a sunrise, warm and full of hope. As they left, Jacob stood in the doorway, the weight of his promise settling over him. He didn't know how to build a robot, didn't know if he could. But he knew he had to try. That night, alone in the garage, Jacob stared at his workbench, the tools his father had left him glinting under the fluorescent light. His father had been a mechanic too, a man who believed in fixing what was broken, no matter the cost. Jacob had taken over the garage at 19, after his father's heart gave out, and he'd carried that lesson like a torch. But this was different. This wasn't a car, wasn't a machine he could wrench back to life. This was Emma, a girl who deserved more than a life confined to a chair. He pulled out a notebook, his hands shaking, and started sketching, the lines messy and uncertain. He didn't know where to begin, but he knew he couldn't stop. Emma's face was there, in every stroke of the pencil, in every sleepless night that followed. And as the days turned to weeks, the garage became a battlefield, littered with failed parts and impossible dreams, all leading to the moment that would change his life forever. The Texas sun was a relentless hammer, pounding the earth outside Jacob Anderson's garage as he sat at his workbench, the air thick with the scent of oil and regret. The business card from Richard Blackwell lay discarded beside a pile of crumpled blueprints, its pristine edges a mocking contrast to the chaos of his world. Just days ago, A private jet had landed outside this very garage, its engines roaring like a storm that had swept Jacob into a future he couldn't grasp. Richard's words echoed in his mind, "You've built something extraordinary, Jacob. This could change millions of lives." The promise of millions, of a world beyond the grease-stained walls of his shop, had been intoxicating, but now, in the quiet of the evening, it felt like a chain. He'd said yes to the CEO, yes to a partnership that could rewrite his life, but the weight of that choice was crushing him. How had a robot, built for a little girl named Emma, pulled him into this whirlwind? To understand, he had to go back, not to the jet's arrival, but further, to the weeks when his life was still his own, when his hands knew only wrenches and his heart knew only duty. It was a month before the jet, before the world noticed him, when Jacob's days were a blur of routine. The garage was his kingdom, its walls lined with his father's tools, its floor scarred by years of labor. He was 42, but the lines on his face told a story of longer years, each one etched by the grind of keeping the shop alive. The town was small, too small for dreams, and Jacob had long since buried his own. He fixed cars, paid bills, and went home to a one-room apartment where the silence was louder than the radio's hum. It was enough, or so he'd convinced himself, until Emma Williams rolled into his life and cracked open a door he'd thought was sealed shut. That day, the bell above the door had chimed, and Jacob had slid out from under a pickup, his hands black with grease. He'd expected Maria, Emma's mother, with her usual tired smile, but it was Emma's eyes that caught him first, bright, unyielding, like they could see through him to the man he'd forgotten how to be. "I wish I could play like the other kids," she'd said, her voice small but heavy, each word a stone dropped into the still waters of his heart. Jacob had seen hardship before, parents struggling, kids facing battles no child should, but Emma's plea was different. It wasn't just a wish, it was a dare, a call to step beyond the life he'd accepted. He'd promised to try, the words slipping out like a reflex, but as Maria wheeled Emma away, her smile brighter than the Texas sun, Jacob felt the weight of that promise settle over him like dust. Back in the garage, alone with his thoughts, Jacob had stared at his workbench, the tools his father had left him glinting like accusations. His father had taught him to fix what was broken, to keep going no matter the cost, but this was no car, no engine he could coax back to life. This was a robot, a machine he'd only seen in movies, something far beyond the skills of a small-town mechanic. Yet Emma's face lingered, her hope a fire he couldn't extinguish. He pulled out a notebook, his hands unsteady, and began sketching, the lines crude and uncertain. He didn't know where to start, didn't know if he could do it, but he knew he couldn't walk away. Not from her. The weeks that followed were a battle against doubt and failure. Jacob worked through the nights, the garage a chaos of wires and gears, each failed prototype a reminder of how far he was from his goal. He wasn't an engineer, wasn't a genius. He was just a man with a promise to keep. The radio played his father's old country tunes, a faint comfort as he wrestled with designs that refused to work. He'd sketch, build, test, and fail, the pile of discarded parts growing like a monument to his inadequacy. One night, after a motor burned out and a gear snapped, Jacob slammed his fist on the workbench, the pain sharp but fleeting. He was tired of the shop, tired of the bills, tired of a life that seemed to demand everything and give nothing back. But then he saw Emma's face in his mind, her smile when she'd asked, "Is that for me?" and he picked up his wrench again. He started small, focusing on what he knew, mechanics, movement, strength. The robot didn't need to be perfect, it needed to help Emma walk, to give her the freedom she'd never had. He studied her wheelchair, the way she moved, the way her hands gripped the wheels with a determination that humbled him. He borrowed books from the library, pages on robotics and engineering that made his head spin, but he pushed through, driven by a stubbornness he hadn't felt in years. Slowly, the robot took shape, a clunky, awkward thing, all bolts and wires, but it was his. It was Emma's. Each piece he welded, each circuit he soldered, was a step toward keeping his promise, toward giving her the chance to run, to play, to be a kid. The night he finished the prototype, Jacob stood back, his hands trembling with exhaustion and hope. The robot was far from elegant, its frame heavy and ungainly, but it moved. It worked. He tested it in the garage, the motors humming as the legs took halting steps, and for the first time in weeks, he laughed, a raw, unsteady sound that echoed in the empty shop. He could see her in it, see Emma's joy, her freedom, and that was enough. He didn't know then that this moment, this small victory, would be the spark that ignited a fire he couldn't control. He didn't know that the world was watching, that a single act of kindness would pull him from the shadows into a spotlight he wasn't ready for. When he wheeled the robot to Emma's house, the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of gold and fire. Emma was by the window, her eyes locked on the kids playing outside, her face a mix of longing and resolve. Maria opened the door, her expression wary but hopeful, and Jacob felt his throat tighten as he pushed the robot inside. "Is that for me?" Emma asked, her voice trembling with a joy that made his chest ache. He nodded, unable to speak, and as she reached for the machine, her small hand steady despite her excitement, Jacob knew he'd done something right. Her first steps were slow, unsteady, but her laughter filled the house, a sound brighter than any engine's roar. Maria's eyes glistened, her hand gripping Jacob's arm, and in that moment, the world was small, perfect, complete. But as he stood in the doorway, watching Emma move with a freedom she'd never known, Jacob felt a flicker of something else, pride, yes, but also a quiet unease. He'd built this for her, for the girl who dared him to dream. But the robot was more than a gift now, it was a door, one that would lead him to a jet, to a man named Richard, to a future he couldn't predict. And to understand how it all began, he had to go back further, to the man he'd been before Emma's wish, to the life that had shaped him, and to the promise that had set this storm in motion. The Texas dusk was a bruise on the horizon, its fading light casting long shadows across Jacob Anderson's garage as he stood before the robot, its wires and gears a silent testament to the life he'd left behind. The business card from Richard Blackwell lay crumpled on the workbench, its promise of millions a distant echo against the hum of his thoughts. Days ago, a private jet had landed outside, tearing through the quiet of his world with an offer that still made his heart race, a partnership, a future, a chance to turn Emma's robot into something that could change lives. He'd said yes, but now, alone in the place that had been his anchor, Jacob felt like a man adrift. The weight of his choice was a stone in his chest, pulling him between the man he was and the man he might become. How had a machine built for a little girl's smile led him to this precipice? To understand, he had to go back, not to the nights he'd spent building the robot, but further, to the days when his world was smaller, when his hands were his only truth and Emma was just a name in a town too small to matter. It was weeks before the robot, before Emma's wish had cracked open his life, when Jacob's days were a rhythm of grit and grind. The garage was his sanctuary, its walls a fortress against the world outside. He was 42, but the years had carved deeper scars, each one a story of loss and survival. His father had died young, his heart giving out under the weight of a life spent fixing other people's problems, and Jacob had taken over the shop at 19, inheriting not just tools but a duty he'd never questioned. The town was a speck on the map, its streets worn and familiar, and Jacob's life was as predictable as the sun's rise. He fixed cars, drank coffee that tasted like tar, and went home to an apartment where the silence was a louder reminder of the family he'd never built. He didn't dream of more, not wealth, not fame, just a life where the bills were paid and the work was honest. That was enough, or so he'd told himself. The garage was his father's legacy, its shelves lined with tools that still carried the old man's fingerprints. Jacob could still hear his voice, rough but kind, "Fix what's broken, son, no matter how hard it seems." That lesson had carried him through the years, through the lean months when the bank called, through the nights when the loneliness was a weight he couldn't shake. He'd never married, never had kids. There'd been a girl once, years ago, but she'd left for a bigger life, and Jacob hadn't chased her. He wasn't the chasing kind. He was the staying kind, the kind who kept the shop running, who kept the town's engines humming, who kept his promises even when they hurt. But lately, the shop felt less like a home and more like a cage, its walls closing in with every unpaid invoice, every ache in his back. It was a Tuesday, unremarkable except for the heat that made the air shimmer, when Maria Williams first came to the garage. Jacob was under a sedan, wrestling with a stubborn bolt, when the bell chimed. He slid out, wiping his hands on a rag, and saw her standing there, her nurse's scrubs wrinkled from a double shift. Maria was a regular, her old minivan always on its last legs, but this time she wasn't alone. Emma sat beside her, her wheelchair a quiet presence, her eyes scanning the garage with a curiosity that made Jacob pause. He'd seen her around town, always with that same defiant spark, but they'd never spoken. "Got a problem with the van?" he asked, his voice gruff from disuse. Maria shook her head, her expression soft but strained. "It's not the van, Jacob. It's Emma. She's got something to say." Emma looked up at him, her small hands steady on the wheels of her chair, and her voice was clear, unyielding. "I wish I could play like the other kids." The words were simple, but they hit Jacob like a spark in dry grass, igniting something he hadn't felt in years. He'd heard stories like hers before, kids facing battles bigger than themselves, but this was different. Emma wasn't asking for pity, she was asking for a chance, a dare to do something impossible. Jacob's first instinct was to deflect, to say he wasn't the guy for this, but her eyes held him, bright and unblinking, and he felt the weight of his father's words, "Fix what's broken." "I'll see what I can do," he said, the promise slipping out before he could stop it. Maria's face softened, and Emma's smile was a sunrise, warm and fierce, burning away the doubts that had already started to creep in. As they left, the garage felt smaller, the air heavier with the weight of what he'd just done. Jacob stood in the doorway, watching Maria push Emma's chair down the cracked sidewalk, and felt a restlessness he couldn't name. He wasn't an inventor, wasn't a hero. He was a mechanic, a man who fixed what he could see, what he could touch. But Emma's wish wasn't a car, wasn't a machine he could wrench into submission. It was a dream, a fragile thing that demanded more than he knew how to give. He turned back to the garage, the tools glinting under the fluorescent light, and felt the first stirrings of fear. What if he failed her? What if he couldn't deliver? But her smile lingered, a challenge he couldn't ignore, and he knew he had to try. That night, Jacob didn't sleep. He sat at his workbench, a notebook open before him, his hands still but his mind racing. The idea of a robot was absurd, something out of a sci-fi flick, not a dusty garage in Texas. But Emma's voice was there, her wish a fire that wouldn't die. He started sketching, his lines clumsy, his ideas half-formed. He thought of her wheelchair, the way her hands moved, the way her eyes lit up at the thought of running with the other kids. He didn't know robotics, didn't know engineering, but he knew machines, knew how to make things work. Maybe that was enough. Maybe it had to be. The days that followed were a blur of research and failure. Jacob haunted the library, borrowing books on mechanics and electronics that made his head ache. He called in favors, scrounged parts from junkyards, spent money he didn't have on motors and wires. The garage became a war zone, its floor littered with scraps of metal and broken dreams. He worked until his eyes burned, until his hands bled, driven by a stubbornness that felt like his father's. Emma's face was his anchor, her hope the only thing keeping him from giving up. And slowly, impossibly, the robot began to take shape, a clunky, awkward thing, but a thing that might just work. As he tightened the last bolt on the prototype, weeks later, Jacob felt a flicker of something he hadn't known in years, pride. It wasn't perfect, but it was his, and it was for her. He didn't know then that this moment would lead him to a jet, to a man named Richard, to a world that would demand everything he had. He didn't know that Emma's wish was just the beginning, that his promise would pull him into a storm he couldn't control. To understand how it all connected, he had to go back one last time, to the man he'd been before the garage, to the losses that had shaped him, and to the spark that had set this miracle in motion. The Texas dawn was a fragile thing, its light soft and uncertain as it spilled across the empty tarmac where a private jet had once landed, changing Jacob Anderson's life forever. He stood outside his garage now, the air cool against his skin, the business card from Richard Blackwell long gone, tucked away like a secret he wasn't ready to face. The memory of that jet, of Richard's voice promising millions, of a world where Emma's robot could be more than a small-town miracle, still burned in his mind. He'd said yes to the CEO, yes to a future that terrified him, but now, as the town woke around him, Jacob felt the weight of his past pulling him back. How had a single act of kindness, a robot built for a little girl's smile, led him to this crossroads? To understand, he had to go back one last time, not to the weeks of building, not to Emma's wish, but to the man he'd been before it all began, to the losses that had forged him, and to the moment that had set this destiny in motion. Years before the jet, before Emma's voice had cracked open his world, Jacob was a boy in this same garage, watching his father work under the hood of a Chevy. The old man's hands were steady, his voice rough but warm, teaching Jacob the rhythm of machines, the honor of fixing what was broken. "Life's like an engine, son," he'd said, wiping grease from his brow. "Doesn't matter how beat up it gets, you keep at it till it runs right." Jacob was 15 then, wide-eyed and certain his father was invincible. But the heart attack came at 52, swift and merciless, leaving Jacob alone in a world that felt too big. He'd buried his father under a Texas sky as gray as his grief, and at 19, he'd taken over the garage, his father's tools the only family he had left. His mother had walked out years earlier, chasing a life that didn't include them, and Jacob had learned early that love was a luxury he couldn't afford. The garage was his anchor, its walls a shield against a world that took more than it gave. The years that followed were a grind, each one blurring into the next. Jacob became the town's mechanic, the guy you called when your truck wouldn't start, the guy who worked late and never complained. He was good at it, damn good, but the shop was a hungry thing, eating up his savings, his youth, his dreams. There'd been a girl once, Sarah, with a laugh that made the world feel lighter, but she'd wanted more than a life tied to a failing garage. "You're stuck here, Jacob," she'd said, her bags packed, her eyes already gone. He hadn't fought for her, hadn't known how. He'd let her go, and the silence she left behind became his constant companion. By 42, Jacob was a man of routine, his hands calloused, his heart guarded, his life a narrow path he walked alone. He didn't resent it, didn't dream of escape. He fixed what was broken, just like his father taught him, and that was enough. Until Emma. Her wish had been a spark, igniting a fire he hadn't known he could carry. "I wish I could play like the other kids," she'd said, and those words had shattered the walls he'd built. Jacob had promised to try, not because he was a hero, but because her hope was a mirror to the boy he'd been, the one who believed in fixing things. The robot had taken weeks, each failure a wound, each success a step toward a girl he barely knew. When he'd wheeled it to her house, her laughter had been a sunrise, her first steps a miracle that made the world feel whole. But that moment, as pure as it was, had been the beginning of something bigger, something that would pull him from his quiet life into a storm he couldn't control. Now, standing in the garage, the robot's frame still in the corner, Jacob felt the weight of it all. The jet had come because of Emma, because of the robot, because a tech giant named Richard Blackwell had seen a video of her walking, shared by Maria on a whim. The world had noticed, and Jacob was no longer just a mechanic. He was a man with a choice, to stay in the life he knew or to step into a future that scared him senseless. Richard's words haunted him, "You're sitting on something huge, Jacob. This could change millions of lives." But what did that mean for the man who'd only ever wanted to fix one girl's world? He'd said yes, but the doubt was a shadow, whispering that he didn't belong in boardrooms, that he'd lose himself in a world of glass and greed. The bell above the door chimed, pulling Jacob from his thoughts. Maria stood there, Emma beside her, her wheelchair a quiet presence. Emma's eyes were bright, her smile as fierce as ever, but Maria's face was lined with worry. "Jacob, you're leaving, aren't you?" she asked, her voice soft but piercing. He froze, the truth too heavy to share. He hadn't told them about the jet, about Richard, about the meeting in New York tomorrow. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice rough. They think the robot can help more kids like Emma. I said I'd try. Maria nodded, her hand resting on Emma's shoulder, but Emma's voice cut through the silence. You did it for me, Jacob. You made me walk. You can do anything. Her words were a jolt, a reminder of why he'd started this. Jacob knelt before her, his eyes level with hers. I did it because you believed I could, he said, his voice thick. You're the brave one, Emma. She reached out, her small hand gripping his, and in that touch, Jacob felt the truth settle. This wasn't about him, wasn't about the jet or the money. It was about her, about kids like her, about a chance to fix what was broken in a world that needed it. He stood, his resolve hardening, and looked at Maria. I'll be back, he said, the words a promise he meant to keep. The next morning, Jacob boarded the jet, his heart pounding as the world he knew fell away. New York was a blur of steel and noise, Richard's office a cathedral of glass that made him feel small. The meeting was a whirlwind, investors, engineers, talk of millions and global impact, but Jacob held fast to Emma's smile, her laughter his anchor. He signed the contract, his hand steady despite the fear, and when Richard shook his hand, his smile was a victory. Welcome to the future, Jacob, he said. Let's change the world. As Jacob stepped out into the city, the skyline no longer a broken promise but a map of possibility, he felt the weight lift. He wasn't the boy who'd lost his father, wasn't the man who'd let Sarah go. He was something new, shaped by a girl's hope, by a father's lessons, by a kindness that had sparked a miracle. The robot was no longer just Emma's, it was a bridge to a future where no child had to wish for a chance to play. He pulled out his phone, dialing Maria's number, and when Emma's voice came through, bright and fierce, he smiled. I'm coming home, he said, and in those words, he found his place, not in the jet, not in the city, but in the heart of a girl who'd changed his destiny, and in the man he'd always been, ready to fix what was broken, one step at a time.